Today's mindful moment. Okay, so have you ever, stepped back and thought about how all the things we consider progress, the speed and convenience, the constant, moving forward,
Yeah.
what if it's actually keeping us from really understanding, ourselves and the world?
Hmm. That's a really interesting thought, and it kind of gets at what this book is all about.
Yeah.
This Ideas Have Consequences by Richard Weaver.
It's a pretty heavy book, though.
It is. It's definitely a product of its time coming out after World War II.
Right.
Grappling with all that destruction.
Yeah, it's not exactly a beach read.
No, not at all. But you're curious about these kind of deeper forces shaping our world.
I was.
And this book takes a look at where Western civilization was headed.
Right.
And his main argument is about this thing he calls the evil decision made by Western thought.
Okay, evil decision. That sounds pretty dramatic.
Yeah, it does.
So what exactly was this decision that Weaver thinks kind of set us on this path?
Well, he points to the shift back in the late 14th century. And it's the abandonment of belief in what he calls transcendentals.
Transcendentals.
Yeah, so think of these as the big ideas, truth, beauty, goodness,
Yeah.
These ideals that people before modern times really believed had an objective reality.
Okay.
But then there's this thing called nominalism that comes along,
Well,
and it basically says, no, these universals, they don't actually exist outside of our own experience of them.
so instead of seeing reality through our intellect, grounded in these objective truths,
Exactly.
we start to define reality by what our senses tell us.
Right, so it becomes more subjective.
So how did that change the way we understand the world? I mean, how do we get from that to where we are now?
Well, the consequence, according to Weaver, is that objective truth becomes harder and harder to find.
Okay.
It opens the door to relativism, which is the idea that truth is subjective. It all depends on your perspective.
Right.
And the really interesting part here is that Weaver connects this philosophical debate from the 1300s to our modern feeling of being unmoored, like we're disconnected from any fixed truth. He calls it the abomination of desolation.
That's pretty powerful imagery.
Yeah, it's intense.
So this philosophical shift from centuries ago, this move towards subjective truth, he's saying that's why we feel kind of lost today.
That's his argument, and he uses this great analogy to illustrate it.
Right, with Macbeth.
Yeah, remember the witches on the heath?
Right.
They offer Macbeth power and immediate gratification, but it comes at a price, right?
Yeah, he loses his moral compass.
Exactly. And Weaver sees this as a kind of Faustian bargain.
Okay.
We trade our loyalty to these transcendent principles, these higher truths, for the immediate pleasure of our senses.
So it's like choosing instant gratification over something deeper and more meaningful.
Exactly. And this idea of focusing on the here and now, it kind of ties into his discussion of materialism.
Okay, so how does this loss of belief in objective truth lead to this obsession with material things?
Well, if truth becomes shaky and subjective,
Yeah.
it makes sense that we might turn to something more concrete.
Right, something we can actually see and touch.
Exactly, the material world. And Weaver argues that this led to people questioning our basic motivations.
Okay.
Biological needs and economic incentives became the main ways to explain human behavior.
So instead of seeing people as moral agents making choices,
Right?
we start to see them more as, just driven by their needs and desires.
More like biological machines in a way.
Right.
And this diminishes the idea of free will
Okay.
and the concept of humans as, spiritual beings with a soul at stake.
Right. So we're not really making conscious choices anymore. We're just responding to these base impulses.
Right. It's all about what we want and what we need right now.
And he really doesn't like this idea of presentism, does he?
No, he's very critical of it. He sees it as this tendency to act like the past doesn't matter.
Right.
Like we can just start fresh every day without any regard for history or what came before.
And why does he think that's so bad?
Because he believes it erodes our sense of who we are, where we come from, and it weakens our ability to be responsible, moral agents accountable to something bigger than just ourselves.
So we lose that connection to the past and the lessons we could learn from it.
Exactly. We become cut off from our roots, in a way.
And he's not too happy with the middle class in all of this, is he?
No, he sees them as playing a big part in this shift towards materialism and presentism.
Okay.
He says they prioritize comfort and security above all else,
Right.
and they fear change or disruption.
So in trying to maintain their comfortable lives, they actually reinforce this focus on the material and the immediate?
Exactly. They become resistant to any kind of deeper reflection or real change.
Interesting. So we've got this loss of connection to transcendentals, this fixation on the present and the material world.
Right.
and the middle class is kind of sleepwalking through it all.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary.
Okay, so then he introduces this really striking metaphor, the great stereopticon.
Yeah.
What's he getting at with that idea?
So the great stereopticon is his way of describing the forces in society that shape our consciousness.
Think of it as like this powerful machine
Okay.
driven by different groups with their own agendas.
Right.
And it projects these carefully selected images of life.
Okay.
And the goal is to keep us all conforming and focused on material comfort.
So it's like a giant projector that's controlling what we see and how we think.
Exactly. And the insight here is that Weaver sees our perceptions as being actively managed.
So it's not just that we're naturally drawn to material things. There are actual forces at work that are encouraging that focus.
Exactly. And what are the tools of this machine, you might ask?
I was just going to ask that.
Media culture. That's the key instrument.
So back then, he's talking about newspapers, movies, radio.
Right.
But today, it's easy to see how television and the internet fit into this.
Oh, absolutely. The function is the same,
Which is...
to present a controlled narrative,
Okay.
hoping that we'll internalize it, imitate it,
Okay.
and stay on the surface of things.
So we don't dig deeper and start questioning things.
Exactly. We just accept the images that are being fed to us. That's a pretty cynical view of media.
It is, but, some channels like Mindful Moments, Nourish Your Mind on the Go, this AI audiobook analysis channel on YouTube.
Right.
They also talk about how we engage with ideas, but from a different perspective.
Right. So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, but Weaver definitely sees the potential for manipulation.
Okay. And he didn't really have a lot of good things to say about contemporary culture in general, did he?
Not really. He even goes after jazz music.
Oh, yeah, I read that part.
It's pre-racially charged and not something we would endorse today.
Right. It's important to remember the context of his time.
Absolutely.
Right.
But he saw jazz as a sign of barbarism,
Wow.
a rejection of intellect and tradition.
So a triumph of emotion over reason.
Right.
Okay. Moving on. He also talks about egotism as another way that society is fragmenting.
Right.
So how does he tie that back to the loss of objective truth?
Well, he says that modern egotism comes from making the individual self the ultimate source of value.
Yeah.
Once those external standards, the transcendentals, are gone, there's nothing left to turn to but the ego.
So it's like we've lost our compass and now we're just wandering around focused on ourselves.
Exactly. And he links this to the Renaissance and that shift in thinking about knowledge.
Okay.
In the Middle Ages, knowledge was often seen as a way to humble yourself before a higher truth. But then you have Francis Bacon saying, knowledge is power.
Right.
And that becomes about individual power.
So knowledge is no longer about understanding a larger order or serving a common good.
Right.
It's about self-aggrandizement.
Exactly. It's a tool for personal gain.
And how does this play out in society?
Well, it leads to fragmentation in all sorts of areas.
Right.
Like the way we work, we prioritize our own individual gain over the collective good.
Okay.
And in politics, personal ambition trumps the needs of the nation.
So it's like everyone's just looking out for themselves.
Exactly. And Weaver even quotes Nathaniel Hawthorne, who called egotism the unpardonable sin.
Wow, that's pretty serious.
Yeah, it shows you how destructive he sees this focus on the self to be.
And this focus on the self and the immediate,
Right.
it seems to affect our personal relationships too.
Right. It leads to what he calls a decay of sentiment.
Okay.
Genuine connection starts to disappear.
So how does this passion for immediacy, as he calls it, how does that play out in our relationships?
Well, he sees it in the way we treat the elderly.
Okay.
They represent the past. They don't offer us much immediate benefit.
Right.
And we see children as burdens.
Okay.
They get in the way of our immediate gratification.
So we're not really valuing those relationships for what they are.
Right. It's all about what they can do for us right now.
And even friendship becomes transactional.
Exactly. He
Yeah.
talks about megalopolis, the big city,
Right.
where friendships are just these utilitarian arrangements.
So you're just pals with someone because you can get something out of it.
Right. There's no real depth or shared understanding.
So he's saying that real friendship requires something more.
Yeah, it needs sentiment, this shared feeling and understanding that comes from common beliefs and values.
So without that shared foundation,
Right.
we're just a bunch of individuals living in close proximity but not really connected.
Exactly. There's no real community or sense of belonging.
And that makes it hard to cooperate, especially when things get tough.
Absolutely. We lose that ability to come together for a common purpose.
Okay, so then he goes on to talk about specialization and the loss of the philosophic doctor.
Right.
What's he getting at there?
So he traces this decline in the ideal of an educated leader.
Okay.
It starts with the philosophic doctor,
Okay.
someone with a broad understanding of the world and human nature.
Right.
Then it moves to the gentleman who is well-rounded and steeped in tradition.
Okay.
But then we end up with the specialist,
Okay.
someone who's an expert in a very narrow field.
And what's wrong with that?
Well, Weaver argues that the specialist can actually suffer from a kind of psychic inferiority.
Psychic inferiority?
Yeah, because they're so focused on their little piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
They lose sight of the bigger picture.
So they might be brilliant in their field, but they lack that broader wisdom and perspective.
Exactly. And they can become obsessed with the means rather than the ends.
So the process becomes more important than the goal.
Right. And this can lead to fanaticism or emotional instability.
So we've traded wisdom and a holistic view for narrow expertise.
Exactly.
And he sees this as connected to presentism as well.
Right. Because when we're constantly focused on the new and the immediate,
Yeah.
we lose touch with the past and the lessons it can teach us.
So we become perpetual beginners in a way.
Exactly. We're always starting from scratch.
And this decline in a shared understanding, it affects language too, doesn't it?
Yes, he talks about the corruption of language and symbolism.
Okay.
And he argues that relativism, this idea that there's no objective truth,
Right.
it undermines the precision and depth of communication.
Right.
We see this rise in looseness exaggeration.
Right, like people just throwing words around without any real meaning.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with his own belief that language is incredibly powerful. He sees it as a storehouse of universal memory, a bridge to deeper meaning.
So language isn't just a tool for communication.
Right.
It's also a way to connect with our shared cultural heritage.
Exactly. And he points to the semanticists who see language as a barrier to reality. They want to strip it down to its most basic form to avoid any misinterpretations.
So just pure utilitarian language.
Right. No room for nuance or symbolism.
And Weaver obviously disagrees with that.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
He sees that as a huge loss.
Right.
We lose the richness and depth of language, its connection to something bigger than ourselves.
And he sees this happening in other areas too.
Yes,
Yeah.
like the decline of formal attire, the discarding of the necktie.
Right.
He sees that as a rejection of important distinctions and hierarchies.
Okay.
Not necessarily unjust hierarchies, but the recognition of different roles and responsibilities.
Right.
And he also points to the decay of honorifics,
Okay.
like Mr., Mrs., Dr., Professor.
Yeah.
He sees that as a sign that we're no longer willing to acknowledge different levels of achievement or experience.
So it's all about leveling everything down.
Right. Everyone's the same. No one stands out.
And then he gets into some pretty controversial territory with his views on gender and the natural order.
Yeah, this is where we need to be careful.
Absolutely.
Because his views are very much a product of his time.
Right. And not something that we would endorse today.
No, not at all. But he criticizes the idea of equality between the sexes.
Okay.
He sees it as a foolish and destructive notion.
And he believes that women have a specific role to play in society.
Yes, primarily within the domestic sphere.
So very traditional views.
Very traditional and not something that most people agree with today.
Right. It's important to approach those parts of his work with a critical eye.
Definitely.
Okay, so moving on to another theme. He talks about comfort and its potential dangers.
Right. He sees this constant pursuit of comfort as another way that we're becoming too focused on the material world.
Okay.
And he worries that it's making us weaker, less resilient,
Okay.
both individually and as a society.
So the more comfortable we get, the less able we are to deal with hardship.
Exactly. And he contrasts this with ancient Greece,
Okay.
which achieved incredible things in art and philosophy,
Right.
despite lacking a lot of the comforts that we take for granted.
So he's not saying that comfort is inherently bad,
Right.
but that it shouldn't be our primary focus.
Exactly. And he even suggests that this obsession with comfort might be connected to a decline in heroism.
Okay.
Because if we're always trying to avoid discomfort,
Yeah.
we're less likely to be courageous or to make sacrifices for something greater than ourselves.
So it's like we're becoming soft.
In a way, yeah.
And this connects to his strong views on private property.
Absolutely. He sees private property as essential for individual liberty.
Okay.
It's a defense against the power of the state.
Right.
And it allows people to pursue what he calls noble preference.
Noble preference.
Yeah, making choices that go beyond just basic needs and material desires.
Okay.
So it's about having the freedom to live according to your values.
And he sees attacks on private property as a way to control people.
Exactly. To reduce them to just biological units that can be managed by the state.
So it's about taking away our individual agency.
Right.
Okay, so finally he brings it all back to this core idea of the metaphysical dream.
Yes.
Can you remind us what that means again?
So the metaphysical dream is the set of beliefs and convictions that a culture holds about the nature of reality.
Okay.
What's true, what's good, what's meaningful.
Right.
And Weaver argues that this shared dream is what gives a society its values, its logic, its unity.
Okay.
But when that dream starts to fade or fragment,
Yeah.
that's when we see confusion and decay.
And he believes that's what's happening in the West.
Exactly. He thinks we've lost our way because we've abandoned those transcendent principles.
This has been a really fascinating look at Richard Weaver's work.
It has.
It's definitely challenging, but it makes you think.
And that's the point, right?
Exactly. So to kind of sum up,
Yeah.
Weaver sees this central tension between our focus on material things and comfort,
Right.
and the erosion of those deeper cultural and moral foundations.
Exactly. And he believes that this shift away from transcendent principles,
Right.
this evil decision, as he calls it,
Yeah.
has had huge consequences for our society.
So it's like we've gained so much in terms of material progress,
Yeah.
but we've lost something essential along the way.
That's the question he's asking us to consider.
Right. And it's a question worth thinking about.
Absolutely.
So what about, have you ever thought about which modern assumptions or ideas maybe you're starting to question?
That's a good question.
And what about those transcendent principles?
Yeah.
Truth, beauty, goodness.
Yeah.
Are those things that we need to reconsider and maybe bring back into our lives?
I think that's something we all need to think about.
Definitely. So if you found this deep dive into Richard Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences thought-provoking, be sure to subscribe to the deep dives for more explorations into these kinds of ideas.
And if you know someone who might appreciate this kind of discussion,
Yes, please share it with them.
and you can find Ideas Have Consequences and explore further using the purchase link in the show notes.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.